Hello and welcome back to our little anime lit club. Today I wanted to talk about Aria of the Beech Forest again. If you're new to this channel, Aria of the Beech Forest is probably my favorite manga series of all time, and I talk about it a lot. The reason I mention this is because I am going to be getting into some heavy spoilers for today's video. So if you haven't read Aria yet, please pause this video, go give it a read, and then come back when you're done. It's only 3 volumes long and it's a masterpiece. Okay, so little spoiler warning aside, today I wanted to take some time to discuss Gwyn's dilemma. But before we can get into that, we need to first look at the context surrounding this dilemma. So, for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the plot of Aria of the Beech Forest, although again, I highly recommend you take the time to read it, the basic plot summary is this. So, the story follows a young witch named Aria. She lives in a treehouse in a secluded forest that's located somewhere in Ireland. Arya used to live with her grandmother, but her grandmother recently passed away and left Arya all on her own. Arya does her best, but is grieving and worried about facing the first winter all on her own. This is when a talking wolf named Gwyn shows up. Gwyn agrees to keep Arya company for the winter and eventually stays even longer than that. As Arya and Gwyn go on little misadventures, they meet nearby humans, and it's revealed that the story takes place in modern day Ireland. With Gwyn's encouragement, Arya socializes with these humans and begins to explore the world outside of her forest. Arya later learns that there is an academy/business for witches over in London that would sponsor her education as a witch. She turns down this offer since she wants to stay in the forest and near her friends, but Gwyn tries to softly encourage her to stretch her wings and leave the forest, and this ultimately leads to a huge fight between them. Now, that's an extreme simplification of the story, but it gives just enough context to discuss Gwyn's dilemma. So, the thing about Gwyn is that he has his secrets. In all, he has about 3 main secrets he has been hiding from Arya. One, he's not just a talking wolf, he's actually a werewolf. Two, he didn't accidentally stumble upon Arya's treehouse. He's actually been here before and knew Arya's grandmother. And then three, in exchange for additional years as a human, Gwyn agreed to watch over Arya after her grandmother passed away. Therefore, their entire relationship was sort of built on a lie. However, Arya doesn't mind any of this since her friendship with Gwyn means more to her than the fact that there was a lie. And yet, there is still more to Gwyn's story. So, Gwyn didn't grow up in Ireland. Instead, he grew up on a magical island that was solely occupied by werewolves. Usually, with werewolf lore, you'll have a man who occasionally turns into a werewolf, and these transformations are usually caused by moon cycles. The werewolves in Ari of the Beech Forest, however, start off by being able to transform between both, but then eventually, as they get older, they become fully wolves and they can't revert back to their human form. Gwyn sort of feared this fate, but also saw that there was really no other options beyond it. However, one day he left the Isle and began to explore the world beyond it, and he saw how wonderful it was and then proceeded to kind of keep sneaking out and ultimately ran away fully once he became a wolf. It was during this exploration, once he was fully transformed as a wolf, that he met Arya's adopted grandmother. And this is when they made that pact that I mentioned earlier. Gwyn used his extra time as a human to continue exploring the world even more and to live among humans. As a result, he values exploring the world and views his family as a cautionary tale. For Gwyn, the worst fate imaginable would be to be stuck in one place forever and to be forced to waste your life not seeing all the wonders that the world has to offer. It's sort of an oversimplification to put it this way, but Gwyn very much has wanderlust, and he's essentially the polar opposite of a homebody. The problem, however, is that Arya is very much a homebody, and this is where Gwyn's dilemma comes up. See, Gwyn promised Arya's grandmother that he would take care of Arya and watch over her. As a result, he feels a sense of responsibility for her and therefore has a certain degree of agency in steering her fate. This is actually a tremendous amount of pressure for someone who is still young and figuring out life themselves. Because if Arya's life ends up being messed up, or if she ends up having major regrets, it's going to feel like those regrets are Gwyn's fault. So if Gwyn doesn't push Arya and encourage her to explore the world, she could come to regret always staying in the forest, and Gwyn would then blame himself for this. But if Arya leaves the forest and regrets leaving, that's also his responsibility, or at least Gwyn would feel like it's his responsibility. If Arya was ultimately well informed on her choice and still wanted to be a homebody, it would be easy for Gwyn to just let her do as she wants. However, there are two key factors muddying the situation. First of all, Arya did not originally choose to be such a homebody. Basically, she was left at Gandriel's house when she was just a baby. Gandriel was traumatized by humanity's scorn for witches after the Irish famine and, as a result, hid away from humanity. All of the other witches left for London, but Gandriel stayed in Ireland but also refused to interact with people. Therefore, Arya was raised in this isolation and was raised to think of this as a normal life. As a result, Gwyn sees Arya's upbringing as being very similar to his own. Gwyn was raised to stay away from humans and with the expectation of always staying on the isolated island. But when Gwyn saw the outside world, he saw how wrong his family was. Therefore, he believes that Arya will come to a similar conclusion if she leaves the forest. However, when Gwyn first proposes this idea to Arya, she outright denies it and refuses to leave the forest. She says she wants to stay in the forest and is against discussing it any further. This is where the second complication arises. Basically, it feels like Arya is avoiding leaving the forest out of anxiety rather than a true contentedness for the forest. However, this is never fully confirmed or denied, and this is kind of the crutch of Gwyn's dilemma. Basically, the question becomes, should Gwyn continue to push Arya to leave the forest since she needs encouragement to overcome her anxiety, or should he just leave her be? If he pushes Arya too hard, she might double down on her anxiety and stay even though she doesn't really want to stay. If he pushes Arya and she regrets leaving, he will feel responsible for this. And if he doesn't push Arya and lets her stay, he could be letting her anxiety control her life. Or he could just be letting her do as she wants. So, what's the right choice here? Before I get into what decision Gwyn ultimately makes, I want to take a moment to talk about why I like this dilemma so much. Basically, I think that this captures a real world dilemma that isn't usually covered in such a nuanced way. Usually, when there's a scenario like this, it's almost always depicted as being very obvious that you should just encourage the person to spread their wings and fly. Stories almost always show the leaving the nest option as being the easiest and most obvious. But Arya of the Beech Forest really takes its time debating both options. Gwyn clearly believes that Arya should leave, and his past experience makes a strong case for his argument. Arya's other guardian, Theodore, however, claims that Gwyn is pushing his own values onto Arya and that he shouldn't be so confident in knowing what is best for Arya. Throughout the story, we see that Theodore is a reliable guardian for Arya, and Arya turns to Theodore when she needs help. Therefore, we can trust his caution here, and we can't disregard his argument. Usually, I feel like stories make the unreliable character here have Theodore's side, and then the best friend gets Gwyn's side, but in this one, they are both reliable best friends. Therefore, the story really highlights that there could be real consequences to Arya leaving. And really imagine yourself in a similar setting. Imagine your friend is debating between two major life altering decisions. One of the options seems like an obvious choice to you based on your own moral compass, but one, is it right to force your values onto your friend? And two, what if things don't work out the way you expect? You're essentially taking a major gamble by speaking up, but you'll also beat yourself up if you say nothing and your friend regrets picking the other option. One final point I want to bring up about why I like this dilemma so much is that for the audience, I think it's even more complicated. This is because Aria of the Beech Forest is such a cozy wish fulfillment type story. Arya gets to live a very simple, cozy, cottagecore esque life. She has friends and a community, plenty of resources, and gets to live out the dream of pretty much anyone who is into the cottagecore aesthetic. Therefore, at least for me, I actually really didn't want Arya to leave the beech forest. This is because she basically was getting to live my dream life, and if she left, she would have to go work at a corporate job in a big city, which is pretty much my nightmare and a little too close to my real life. Therefore, it's almost like seeing someone throw away a winning lottery ticket in a way. So, what does Gwyn ultimately decide? Well, it's sort of complicated. He doesn't fully outright tell Arya to leave, but he does tell her about his own life experience, and in the end, Arya decides to leave. However, she doesn't decide to leave for the reasons Gwyn expresses. Instead, she leaves so that she can try to find a more permanent cure to Gwyn's werewolf curse. So, even though she ultimately decides to leave the forest, it isn't because she wants to explore the world or because she feels smothered by the forest. Instead, it's because she wants to help her friend. Ultimately, I think the story depicts this as being the right choice. Earlier, we see Arya talk to one of her Irish friends, Alvin, and he talks about his dreams of becoming a pilot. And through this conversation, Arya realizes that she doesn't have any big dreams or life purposes. Therefore, her going on this adventure is ultimately part of her finding her life's purpose. Therefore, it's a good thing. However, Alvin's sister, Colleen, who is also Arya's other closest friend, is completely against this decision, and it ultimately harms their friendship. Once Arya decides to leave, Colleen stops coming to the treehouse and turns Arya away whenever Arya comes to visit. Colleen doesn't do this out of spite, however. It's more like Colleen is so emotionally devastated by Arya leaving that she can't bear to see Arya anymore. And it's also possible that Colleen was hoping that this behavior would sort of persuade Arya to change her mind. As a result, Arya and Colleen lose extremely valuable time together, and Arya has to leave having only gotten one short goodbye from Colleen at the airport. Colleen's role in the ending of Aria of the Beech Forest is genuinely one of the most devastating parts of the plot, and it gets me every time. I feel like whenever we lose someone, we always regret not spending more time with them. Usually, we are able to comfort ourselves by saying, well, I tried my best, and ultimately, I did have to go to work or go to school, etc., etc. But Colleen actively avoided Aria and now has to deal with that. It's a really rough ending, and there's a certain degree of heartbreak that comes with it. As a result, Gwyn's choice didn't come without its consequences. So, what are your thoughts on Gwyn's dilemma? Do you think that he made the right choice, or do you think that he ultimately forced his own values on Arya? What would you have done in this situation? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Oh, and also one final thing. I just realized a new devastating aspect of this ending. So I legit cried when I finished reading this story, and one of the only things that really comforted me afterwards was knowing that at least Gwyn would be with Arya in London so their friendship could continue. However, if Arya cures Gwyn and he's able to become human again, doesn't that mean he likely will have to leave and, go explore the world more as a human? As a wolf, he can stay in her dorm/apartment and hang out with her while she studies, etc. This is because they're friends, but also because he can't just, wander into a restaurant and order food in the human world as a wolf. But that dynamic would have to change drastically if he became a human again, right? Also, one of the other witches could probably just cure him immediately after they arrive, so Arya might not even get the time it would take to figure out a spell. So, when you think about it, it's sort of worth mentioning that if Gwyn hadn't encouraged Arya, they could have stayed together in the Beech Forest and never had their wonderful dynamic change because if Gwyn stays with Aria as a human, I feel like she's going to feel like he's staying and unhappy because she knows how much exploring means to him. And also, if he wanted to stay, again, it would be a lot more oppressive of a lifestyle for him to have to just hang out in her room while she's gone. Because while he's a wolf, he can do it and it's less funky, but it's not a good life for someone who's a human. So things will definitely change. And it's sort of heartbreaking realizing that in an alternate universe, things never had to change. And he would just stay as a talking wolf and she would have her little cottagecore life in the Beech Forest.